So there's an embedding transformer. Elastic provides one of those. That creates a bunch of vectors. It goes into a vector database, which Elastic also is. And there's a bunch of other vector databases in this market too, Pinecone and Vectara and other things, right? So you're sort of competing against them, but you have the added benefit of all of the search relevance that they don't because of Elastic's history. Then when I ask a question, that goes through the transformer again. It pulls up a vector from the vector database, and I push that through GPT-4 to get my actual answer generated, or Elastic is generating the answers now too, or what is that final piece?
Yeah, so the final piece is that once you get that set of vectors back, or the most relevant vectors back, you reference the original text that vector represents, right? Because you want to ultimately what you want to present to the foundation model is at the end you want to present, hey, this is the natural language question that the user typed in, and this is the context in which we would like you to answer it, or we'd like you to use this context to answer that question. So that also needs to be natural language. But yeah, that is kind of the last point. And in many cases, that last stage, we're pushing all of that text to something like OpenAI or Bard or one of the other foundation models. That is, we don't do that behind the hood. That's something that that at least in the case of Elastic, our users use us for all the retrieval, and then they plug it into OpenAI's API. We do have a little connector that will connect on your behalf, but it uses your API key. We don't try to hide the fact that you're ultimately going to be, if you choose to, you would be sending that data over to Azure's OpenAI service or the OpenAI API directly. But that is typically the very last stage. But what I was saying, which may have been the confusing part, is that over time, that very last stage can potentially be solved by not just Bard or Llama or ChatGPT. It could be solved by other LLMs that have been distilled and kind of shrunk in a way that you could actually potentially pull that process.
Those are the domain-specific ones you were talking about.
Well, they could be domain specific, or they could just be very, tuned for specific kinds of question answering, but they don't have to be. I don't know anything that isn't public about GPT, those models, but I think GPT-3 was something like a 780 gigabyte model when it was finally fully trained. So that's 780 gigabytes of RAM that you need to just to load the model, and that, not to mention the computing power to do inference on it and how quickly you can do that to actually start producing an answer. That's something that you want running on specialized hardware somewhere in a data center, probably not running inside of your Elasticsearch cluster. But if you could imagine something that is capable like a GPT style model that is tuned for question answering, but is 32 gigabytes of RAM as opposed to 780 gigabytes, then that's something that it's more reasonable that you might run locally inside of your own data center or inside your own infrastructure. And what we're seeing with open source models, which I, of course, maybe my background just indicates this, I believe in open source. I think that open source will have a bright future in this area, just like it has everywhere else. We may see open source models really do some incredible things. So I wanted, part of the strategy that we've had at Elastic is, as we think about this, how we fit into this ecosystem, is to maintain an open viewpoint on where customers put the LLMs and which LLMs they want to choose. And we want to make it so that you can bring an open source LLM that Elastic has nothing to do with, that is something or something that you've trained yourself even. And I think that having that kind of open perspective will serve us well, because it's hard to predict where where the ultimate value is going to be created. I think there's a good bet that a lot of the best work will ultimately end up in the open source domain, because that tends to be one of the trends. Now, I'm sure there are a lot of people who would disagree with that, but I do think that there's even if that's not true, I think because we are mostly unopinionated about it, we can, you can still integrate with OpenAI if you'd like to, or you can integrate with, Bard or whatever other, of the foundation models are run by the really largest companies out there.